There comes a stage in every man's life when he realizes that not every battle needs a roar, and not every truth deserves to be spoken out loud. The world teaches men to respond, to defend, to justify, to prove themselves at every turn. But maturity whispers a different truth. A man's power often lives in what he does not say, because words can betray him, emotions can expose him, and reactions can be used against him. Silence, however, belongs only to him. Silence is where a man retreats to sharpen his clarity, to regain control, to rebuild strength without anyone watching. It is the space where he stops being consumed by the noise of others and starts hearing his own voice again. A man's silence is not a void. It is a boundary. Not a weakness, a discipline. Not surrender, strategy. Before a man learns how to speak with purpose, he must learn how to be quiet with intention. Before he learns when to react, he must learn when to withdraw. Before he learns what is worth fighting for, he must learn what is beneath his level to even acknowledge. And that journey begins with understanding the moments when silence isn't just wise, it is necessary for survival. Number 1. When silence protects a man more than words ever could. There comes a point in every man's life when silence becomes more powerful than anything he could ever say. Not the silence of fear, not the silence of defeat, but the silence of someone who understands that words, once spoken, cannot be taken back, cannot be softened, cannot be controlled. A man's silence is his fortress. It is the place he retreats to not because he is weak, but because he knows that speaking in the wrong moment can cost him more than staying quiet ever will. Silence is not the absence of strength, it is the preservation of it. And the moment a man realizes this is the moment he begins to mature into a version of himself that no one can manipulate. There are times when emotions burn like wildfire inside his chest. Frustration, disappointment, anger, betrayal, and everything in him screams to react, to confront, to demand answers. But a man learns, through pain and experience, that reacting in the heat of emotion is how battles are lost. That's when he understands the first truth of masculine growth. You don't silence yourself for others, you silence yourself for your own clarity. Because clarity never comes while speaking. It comes when everything goes still, when the noise dies, when the world stops pulling on you from every direction. A man must choose silence when he feels himself drowning in anger. Anger turns words into weapons, and once they leave your mouth, you can never call them back. The boy speaks impulsively. The man waits until the fire cools. The boy wants to be right. The man wants to stay in control. The boy shouts to be heard. The man stays silent so he can hear himself think. The silence of a man in anger is not suppression. It is emotional discipline. It is the moment he refuses to let someone else control his reactions through provocation. He must also choose silence when he stands in rooms where he is not respected. A man who explains himself to people committed to misunderstanding him wastes the breath he should be saving for his future. There is power in walking away quietly from those who cannot appreciate depth, loyalty, or sincerity. Silence is the answer to disrespect, because disrespect thrives on engagement. When a man gives no reaction, he gives no access. And nothing terrifies small minds more than a man they cannot provoke. There are moments when silence becomes a shield, especially when someone tries to twist his words, poke at his insecurities, or drag him into drama that serves no purpose but to drain his energy. Silence in these moments is not avoidance, it is strategy. You do not win arguments with people who enjoy the argument more than the resolution. A man learns that some battles are not fought with fists or words, but with the refusal to participate. And then comes the silence that hurts the most. The silence he must choose when he knows he has outgrown a situation, a friendship, or a relationship. The silence that follows the realization that he can no longer stay where he is, but does not yet know where he is going. That silence is terrifying, but it is also sacred. It is the cocoon before transformation. It is the moment life demands he shed his old version. A man does not always break loudly. Sometimes he breaks in silence, in private, without witnesses. And in that quiet collapse, he begins to rebuild himself into something more grounded, more disciplined, more whole. Silence is a man's first step toward sovereignty. It is the moment he stops explaining his value, stops negotiating his worth, stops proving himself to people who don't deserve access to his truth. A man who has mastered silence is dangerous, not because he is violent, not because he is cold, but because he is no longer governed by impulse or emotion. He speaks when he decides. He reacts when it matters. He moves only with intention. And that is when he becomes untouchable. Not loud, not boastful, just quietly powerful. Number 2. When silence saves a man from destroying himself. There are moments in a man's life when the biggest threat he faces is not the world outside, but the chaos inside his own mind. When emotions run high, when pride is wounded, when ego demands revenge, when anger rises like a storm, that is when a man becomes most dangerous to himself. Because in those moments, one wrong word, one impulsive reaction, one uncontrolled outburst can cost him relationships, opportunities, dignity, and sometimes even his entire future. This is why a man must learn the art of stepping back, closing his mouth, and letting silence absorb the fire before he burns everything he has built. A man must be silent when his emotions sit too close to the surface. Anger distorts perception. Pain amplifies insecurity. Fear makes enemies out of shadows. When a man speaks from these states, his words are not truth, they are explosions. Words spoken in emotional heat don't solve problems. They create new ones. They wound people who didn't deserve it and give power to people who did. The strongest men are not those who lash out, but those who can cage the storm long enough to let reason return. Silence in that moment becomes an act of protection, not for others but for himself. It is choosing not to bleed on the wrong people. There are also moments when silence is necessary because a man has nothing constructive to add, only anger looking for a direction. Silence keeps him from escalating conflict into war. It keeps him from saying things he will regret, from exposing vulnerabilities to those who might use them, from allowing temporary pain to create permanent damage. Many men ruin relationships not because they are bad men, but because they speak too quickly, too loudly, too emotionally, forgetting that some things once said cannot be undone. Silence is the pause that saves him, the distance that protects him, the breath that keeps him from crossing lines he cannot return from. A man must be silent when he feels the urge to explain himself to someone who has already made up their mind. Nothing drains a man's spirit more than arguing with someone committed to misunderstanding him. Silence becomes wisdom here, because it keeps him from wasting energy trying to fix what was broken long before he entered the conversation. Not every accusation deserves a defense. Not every disrespect deserves a reaction. Not every conflict deserves your participation. Silence is the moment he recognizes the futility of trying to correct the perspective of those who thrive on chaos, drama, and emotional manipulation. There are moments, too, when a man must stay silent because the words forming in his mouth reveal more about his wounds than about the situation at hand. When the truth he wants to speak is shaped by older pain, trauma, or insecurity, silence becomes an act of self-awareness. He must learn to ask himself, am I reacting to this moment, or to a lifetime before it? Silence gives him the space to separate old pain from new reality, to avoid projecting past wounds onto innocent people, to stop himself from repeating the cycle of destruction he once suffered. In silence, he finds clarity to see things for what they are, not for what his past tells him to fear. A man must be silent when the world provokes him to defend his pride. Pride is the most deceptive enemy. It pushes him to prove himself, to show he is not weak, to react because a real man would never stay quiet. Yet true strength is the opposite. True strength is restraint. A man who cannot control himself loses control of everything else. Silence is the rejection of ego. It is the moment he chooses peace over performance, growth over validation, truth over reaction. When a man masters silence in moments of pride, he stops letting the world dictate his worth. But perhaps the most important silence a man must embrace is the silence after failure. The silence where guilt and regret echo loudly. The silence where he faces the consequences of his mistakes. This silence is painful, suffocating, relentless, but it is where growth begins. A man who fills that silence with excuses never evolves. A man who fills it with noise never learns. But a man who allows himself to sit in that silence, to confront the truth without running, becomes someone entirely new. Accountability grows in silence. Discipline grows in silence. Reinvention grows in silence. When a man learns to use silence not as escape but as mastery, he becomes a different kind of force. He no longer reacts to the world, he responds to it. He no longer speaks to be heard, he speaks to be understood. He no longer tries to win every argument, he saves his voice for the battles that matter. That is the moment he steps out of boyhood and into manhood. The moment he becomes a man not controlled by emotion, but guided by wisdom. Silence does not make a man passive. It makes him precise. And precision is what keeps him from destroying his own life. Number 3. When silence becomes a man's shield of dignity. There are moments in a man's life when speaking does not elevate him. It diminishes him. Moments when every word he says becomes fuel for someone else's arrogance, entertainment for someone else's ego, or leverage for someone else's manipulation. A man who values his dignity learns that silence is not just restraint, it is protection. It is the armor he wears when he stands before people who do not respect him, understand him, or deserve the weight of his truth. A man must understand this deeply. Not every situation requires his voice, but every situation tests his character. A man needs silence when he is surrounded by people who mistake calmness for weakness. The immature will try to provoke him, pushing boundaries with subtle insults, sarcastic jabs, or childish challenges. They expect him to defend himself, to react, to prove something. But a dignified man does not dance for clowns. He does not try to justify his worth in front of those who measure value through noise. When a man stays silent in the face of provocation, he is not losing. He is refusing to play a game beneath his level. He is letting others reveal who they are while preserving who he is. A man must also choose silence when arguing would only entangle him in the pettiness of others. Not every confrontation needs a response. Not every disagreement deserves energy. Some people argue not to seek truth, but to assert dominance, to manipulate emotion, to feed their insecurity. A dignified man knows that arguing with such people is like wrestling in mud. Even if he wins, he ends up dirty. Silence becomes a statement stronger than any sentence. I do not fight where dignity cannot survive. His silence is not avoidance. It is the highest form of self-respect. There are moments when silence becomes the only language of pride, the good kind, the kind that protects a man's values, not his ego. When someone disrespects him publicly, twists his intentions, or reduces his worth to a misunderstanding, the impulse is to defend, to explain, to prove innocence. But a man of dignity understands that defending himself to the wrong audience cheapens him. When someone has already decided what they want to believe, your truth becomes irrelevant. Explaining yourself becomes a performance they enjoy. So a man stays silent, not because he cannot speak, but because he refuses to spill his truth into hands unworthy of holding it. A man's silence becomes sacred in moments where speaking would betray his principles. There are situations where anger is justified, where retaliation is deserved, where confrontation is fully earned. Yet the man chooses silence not because he is weak, but because he is wise enough to see the long road ahead. Silence becomes a promise to himself. I will not let this moment define my future. He withdraws not as an escape, but as an act of self-preservation, of long-term vision. The boy wants victory today. The man seeks peace tomorrow. Silence is the bridge between the two. There are times when silence is the only way a man can avoid being dragged into the chaos of someone else's insecurity. Some people attack what they fear, your confidence, your independence, your calm, your competence. They poke at you hoping to get a reaction that validates their belief that you are just like them. But a man with dignity does not collapse into the emotional gravity of those who try to pull him down. He stands still, unmoved, untouchable. His silence becomes a mirror in which the insecure see their own reflection, a truth they cannot escape. And then there is the deepest silence of all, the silence a man chooses when he knows that speaking would only lower his character. When someone betrays him, lies about him, mocks him, or walks away from him without reason, silence becomes his final answer. not because he has nothing to say, but because he knows his words will not change the outcome. A dignified man does not chase explanations, validation, or apologies. He does not beg for clarity. His silence is the full stop at the end of a chapter he has decided to close. His silence is the dignity that says, I release you, and I rise without you. A man's silence is misunderstood by the world because the world praises noise. But there is no noise more powerful than a man who refuses to be shaken, provoked, or diminished. A man who holds his tongue holds his power. A man who chooses silence chooses self-respect. A man who can walk away quietly becomes someone no insult can reach, no manipulation can trap, no chaos can bend. In the end, silence is not the absence of a voice. It is the presence of dignity, and the man who masters it becomes unbreakable. Number 4. When silence allows a man to see what noise always hides. There are seasons in a man's life when he must step back from the crowd, retreat from the chaos, and embrace silence not as withdrawal but as vision. Because silence is not only a shield, it is a lens. A man cannot truly see the world while he's constantly speaking, reacting, or defending himself. Vision requires stillness. Insight requires distance. Understanding requires a quiet mind. A man who never learns to be silent will never learn to really see. Because noise blinds, but silence reveals. A man must be silent when he needs to observe people's true nature. Words deceive, smiles perform, gestures hide intentions, but silence forces truth to surface. When a man stops talking, people start showing. Their insecurities, their lies, their loyalties, their fears, their envy, their sincerity. All of it becomes clearer when he withdraws into silence. People reveal themselves when they think you are not paying attention. They expose the truth when you give them nothing to react to. Silence turns a man into a mirror that reflects people back to themselves. And what he sees in those reflections becomes the foundation of his wisdom. There are moments when silence becomes the teacher of intuition. A man's instinct is one of his most powerful weapons, but instinct does not grow in noise. It sharpens in quiet. When he is silent enough to hear the tension in a room, the shift in someone's voice, the gap between what they say and what they mean, he begins to notice the subtle threads that connect intention to action. Silence helps him hear the truth beneath the surface. And once a man learns to trust what he observes in silence, he is rarely ever fooled again. A man needs silence when he enters a new environment, a new job, a new group, a new relationship, a new network. Speaking too soon exposes him prematurely. Listening first positions him correctly. Silence gives him time to understand the hierarchy, the dynamics, the unspoken rules. It lets him see who leads quietly and who pretends loudly, who is genuine and who is performing, who respects him and who underestimates him. The loud man enters a room trying to impress. The wise man enters a room studying the terrain. Silence is his strategy, and observation is his advantage. There are also moments when silence helps a man separate truth from emotion. When the world pushes him to react instantly, silence gives him space to analyze what is real and what is imagined. He learns to distinguish between facts and feelings, between what people say and what they actually mean, between stories he's told and stories he tells himself. Noise creates confusion. Silence creates clarity. And clarity is what keeps a man from making decisions he will regret. A man must choose silence when he senses something is off, not because he is afraid, but because he knows observation is the only way to discern whether a situation deserves his trust or his distance. Silence helps him notice patterns. The subtle disrespect hidden in jokes, the envy disguised as compliments, the manipulation disguised as kindness, the inconsistencies disguised as innocence. In silence, a man becomes fluent in human nature. He sees not just actions but intentions, not just words but motives, not just faces but character. There are moments when silence allows a man to notice his own truth, something noise always drowns out. In silence, he hears his fears, his desires, his doubts, his needs. He hears the voice he ignored for years because he was too busy living for others, proving himself to others, fighting battles that weren't his. Silence becomes a reunion with himself, a moment where his intuition, his reason, and his emotions align long enough for him to understand what he truly wants and what he must walk away from. A man who learns to listen to himself in silence becomes less vulnerable to manipulation, because the world can only confuse a man who is already confused within. And then there is the silence that gives a man vision for his future. When he stops explaining himself, defending himself, and chasing validation, he begins to see the path ahead clearly. Silence allows him to imagine, strategize, create, rebuild, and plan without interference. A man evolves fastest when he evolves quietly, out of sight, out of noise, out of comparison. People cannot sabotage what they cannot see. Growth is safest in silence. Transformation is purest in silence. Purpose is born in silence. In the end, silence does more than protect a man. It educates him. It sharpens him. It arms him with the understanding that noise is where confusion thrives, but silence is where truth lives. A man who knows how to observe in silence becomes someone who cannot be deceived, manipulated, or surprised. He becomes someone who sees life with clarity and people with accuracy. Someone who moves with intention and chooses with discernment. A man's silence is not emptiness. It is insight, and insight is what sets him apart from the world. Number 5. When silence protects a man's inner peace and energy. There comes a point in a man's life when he realizes that not everyone deserves access to his mind, his emotions, or his energy. The world is filled with people who drain, people who take without giving, who demand without appreciating, who feed off your strength because they cannot generate their own. And one of the greatest skills a man must learn is knowing when to withdraw his presence, his words, and his emotional availability. Silence becomes his protection, not from danger, but from depletion. Because a man who gives himself away to everyone eventually becomes empty for himself. A man must choose silence when he senses his energy being drained. Some people do not attack directly, they drain slowly, through constant complaining, hidden jealousy, emotional instability, or the subtle expectation that you must always be there to fix them. They come to you not because they value you, but because they need you. And if a man is not careful, he becomes their emotional battery, constantly charged by his strength, constantly emptied by their chaos. Silence is the moment he stops feeding the wrong people. It is the moment he protects his energy by refusing to engage with those who only take. A man needs silence when people try to pull him into drama that has nothing to do with him. Some situations are traps, designed to provoke him, to drain his mental focus, to distract him from his path. The loud world wants his attention because attention is energy. But a disciplined man gives his energy only to what deserves it. He stays silent where others shout. He stands still where others rush. He withdraws when others demand explanation. This silence is not avoidance, it is power. It is the refusal to be used as fuel for someone else's emotional fire. There are moments when silence becomes the way a man protects his mental health. The mind is fragile when overstimulated, overwhelmed, or overstressed. Noise from the outside world, opinions, expectations, arguments, criticism, becomes poison if consumed constantly. A man who never retreats into silence becomes a man who loses himself in the demands of others. But in silence, he gathers himself again. He listens to his thoughts. He untangles his emotions. He reconnects with his purpose. Silence is the place where a man recharges the strength the world constantly tries to drain. A man must also stay silent when someone is fishing for a reaction. Some people feed off emotional responses. They find satisfaction in your anger, your irritation, your defensiveness. They provoke not because they care, but because it gives them power over you. A man who reacts gives control away. A man who stays silent maintains control. Silence frustrates manipulators. It exposes their desperation for your attention. When a man refuses to respond, he starves their influence, strips their leverage, and protects his peace. There are moments when silence is the only way for a man to stay centered. The expectations of society weigh heavily on men. Be strong, be stable, be successful, be unshaken. But every man needs a place to exhale, to collapse inward for a moment, to feel without performing. Silence becomes that sacred space. In silence, he does not need to prove anything. He does not need to justify his existence. He does not need to carry the world. Silence becomes the room where he sets his burdens down, even if just for a moment. A man needs silence when he is overwhelmed by too many voices. Everyone has an opinion on how he should live, what he should do, who he should become. But if a man listens to every voice except his own, he becomes a stranger in his own life. Silence is how he returns to himself. It filters out the noise, the pressure, the expectations. It brings him back to the only voice that matters, the one inside his chest. A man who cannot hear himself becomes lost. A man who learns to listen to his inner voice becomes unshakable. And then there is the silence a man chooses when he decides to heal. Healing does not happen in conversations, in crowds, or in distractions. It happens in stillness. It happens when a man sits alone with his pain long enough to understand it, long enough to accept it, long enough to release it. Healing is not something you talk your way into. It is something you endure silently until the weight begins to fall away. Silence becomes the womb of transformation, the place where old versions die and new versions begin to breathe. In the end, silence preserves a man's soul in a world that tries relentlessly to strip him of it. It becomes his sanctuary, his shield, his recharge station. A man who protects his peace becomes someone with depth, stability, and presence. He is not easily shaken, not easily drained, not easily manipulated. His silence becomes the boundary no one can cross without his permission. Because a man's energy is sacred, and silence is how he guards it. Conclusion: the power a man gains when he masters silence. In the end, a man's silence becomes more than a tool. It becomes a signature of the life he has chosen to build. The world will always try to pull him into noise, provoke him into reaction, and push him into battles that are beneath his purpose. But the man who has learned when to speak and when to stay silent is no longer controlled by emotion, chaos, or the expectations of others. He becomes governed only by clarity, by intention, by discipline. Silence teaches him who he is without masks. Silence reveals who others are without performances. Silence protects the energy he needs to build the life he wants. Silence gives him vision when the world tries to blind him with distractions. And somewhere along that journey, he realizes a truth he once overlooked. A man's strength is not proven by how loudly he speaks, but by how deeply he understands what is worth speaking for. He becomes the man who no longer wastes breath on arguments that steal his peace, no longer hands reactions to people who haven't earned them, no longer explains himself to those who refuse to listen. He no longer rushes into everything. He chooses what deserves his presence. His silence is not emptiness. It is intention. It is control. It is maturity. A man who has mastered silence walks differently, not proudly but firmly, not loudly but powerfully, not desperately but peacefully. Because now he understands that silence is not what keeps him small. It is what keeps him sovereign. And when a man reaches that point, no noise in the world can shake him. He speaks when he chooses. He reacts when it matters. He moves with purpose, not impulse. He lives with calm, not chaos. That is the quiet strength of a man who knows himself. That is the kind of silence the world cannot break.